Okay, right, hello and welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about randomness and how with a little bit of extra control in our randomness we can add some nice elements of polish to our effects really simply and easily. So I have here a quick simple spark burst and generally when we're making VFX what we're trying to do is replicate the real world, and the real world is very random. Computers are very not random, they're very good at repeated and replications and things. And so what we want to do generally is randomize everything. And you can see here we've got random velocity, we've got random lifetime, random size, all of those values randomized within our emitter. We might want to go in and do a random amount. 5075. Now we're going to get a random amount in here as well. So everything we want to randomize, we're going to want to, or everything we could control, we're probably going to want to randomize to try and create as much variation as possible. So random lifetime, random size, different random color, some random velocity in here. I've got an additional upwards velocity that could be randomized as well. All of this, and let's do 150, 250, something like that. All just creating as random and sort of visually interesting an effect as we can. Now this works, this is cool, but there is a slightly better way of doing this, or a slightly different technique which I like to use. And if we think about actually what's happening, this is a little glowing piece of metal that sparked off something, and it's flying through the air, but it has a sort of certain level of physicality to it. It's a piece of metal. The bigger it is, the longer it's going to glow for. It's actually burning through the air. And so while we do want to create as much randomness as possible and randomize everything, we don't necessarily want those random things to be independent of each other. And so what we're able to get here is small sparks that live for a long time, big sparks that kind of like the size and the brightness, they sort of should be connected in some way. And that's what we're going to do in our second one. So if I jump over here, so if you have a look at these, and it is a subtle effect, hopefully it comes through on the video compression and things, but the one here on the left, everything in it is completely randomized, and that's definitely a look, definitely works. But the one here on the right, I've just created a random value. Now the random range, apart from those changes I just made, the random values in this case are the same. So the lifespan is was randomized between 0.2 and 0.8, and that's the same in both cases. But what's happening here on the right is I've used my random value and then I'm controlling multiple parameters and multiple properties with the same thing. Now I have termed this Heft, so kind of the term for something physical, some physicality. Let's see if I can bring up the definition of Heft. Oops. So to lift or carry something, or the weight of something. So if you were doing sort of axe chopping wood, that kind of thing, you would say the heft of the thing in your hand, how it feels to physically move it. That would be my kind of understanding of this word. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm kind of creating a parameter that's to do with the physicality of the thing that we're working here. So in this spark, how big is it? How much glow does it have? And then the way we set this up is actually very simple. All I'm doing, first thing in the particle spawn, set my Heft value, so randomize a value between 0 and 1, and then I'm using that within my my system instead of using randomization. So before, what we had was a random value between 0.2 and 0.8. Now instead I'm going to do a direct value, and if we do a lerp and use the Heft value as the input to that lerp, and again I can do 0.2 and 0.8. And now by repeating this, I'm using the same random value to control three different things. And so in this case, the particles that live the longest are also going to be the brightest and also the biggest. And that gives it a sort of an extra level of complexity or physical realness, I think, to this kind of effect. Now we can go in and do the same thing here. So the velocity. So the bigger the particles, the faster they move. And it isn't always the case that you want the biggest and most, sort of the highest range on both sides. So in this case, maybe the bigger particles are a bit heavier. Well, we could add a small value here, and you can see very quickly the difference in visual that's given. So now the big particles are all in the middle because they have the lowest velocity, and the small particles are the ones on the outside because they have the high velocity. Now I've not changed the randomness and I've not changed the range. What I've done is I've changed the sort of the distribution, and you can see how that gives a completely different look depending on what we're trying to make, which I think is a really nice, powerful way of doing this. And so, for example, here we changed this before, didn't we, to have a bit more range. Well, let's use our heft again. So it was 150, 0, 0, 250, and there we go. So now our particles, the ones that randomize a big value up here, are now being pushed further up. And again, we could try that on both sides. So do you want the bigger ones? Well, maybe they're a bit heavier, they don't go up as high. Maybe they want to have a bit more on the lower end. But by creating that randomness once, using it in different ways, we're able to create this kind of connection between these things. Cool, works really well. Definitely anything that has a sort of physical element to it, I would recommend this kind of thing. I think it adds that subtle difference. Let me just reset these. You have to watch it a few times to really sort of notice it. And like I say, it is definitely a subtle thing, but it's also a very quick and cheap way of doing this. But I think the one on the left, it just has a bit too much randomness. It loses a certain level of physicalness to it. If you look at sparks bursting, there are going to be connections between size and scale and velocities and things. So, worth checking in and trying down a little bit of randomness to these things. Cool. Second technique I want to talk about today is using randomness within our frame rate. So this is another slightly unexpected way to use randomness. So I have here 5 copies of the same emitter, or same system I should say, and the one here on the left, let's do this one, fixed frame rate. This is the same frame rate for everyone. So this is our comparison, and you can see it's really repetitive. Now there's lots of things we could do to randomize this, so we can randomize the size and the scale, the start frame, the play rate, all of those things, and they all work really well, but you're always going to get the same kind of progression from frame to frame. And what I wanted to try was, can I randomize that? Can I change it so rather than being each frame is always one frame ahead of the previous one, can we get away with kind of breaking that up in some way with some randomness? And that's what I've done here. Now again, it's quite a subtle thing, so you need to look at it for a little while, but if you look, if I reset this, everything's going to be completely synchronized, and you can see the kind of the burst and the thing that's in there. Now obviously the flipbook and the shapes that's within the flipbook are always going to be the same, but over time they're starting to sort of diverge a little bit, and now if you sort of rest your eyes a little bit and have a look, they're quite different. Now all I've done, and again we can add size and scale and play rate and all those things in later, is in my sub UV, I'm setting the frame rate directly. Now in this case we're doing a random value and adding that to our particle every frame. And so let me just recreate this from scratch. So I'll do set new existing parameter directly, particle index, and then this is already plugged in to our animation frame here. And so you can see our value here is set, if I value 1, 2, 3, so it's taking a float value here and then converting it into a frame number, so 6.5, 7.5. If I do anything from 7.0 to 7.99, it's obviously going to be the same frame output in here. And what we can do is every frame I want to take my particle index and I want to add my particle index. I want to add 1 to my particle index. So I take the index and I be particle index plus 1. So now I've created a sequential one frame after another, linear progression, which is what already exists in here. If I change this to what's the option? Direct index to linear. That's what we're already getting. So now it's doing one frame after another. And it should, if I... Why is it not showing me anything on that one? Interesting. Close of live demos. It's just off screen. There we go. I'd obviously zoomed in too far. Classic. I've moved them off screen so that you can see them side by side. Let's do that. There we go. And what we should find is this is doing a linear progression of frames, and this is doing adding one every frame. Now this is not exactly the same because of the frame rate limiting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see how they're just kind of like progressively moving forwards. So what do I want to do? Well, instead of adding one to my float every frame, I want to add a random value. Now in this case, the randomization comes up with this evaluation type. Now this is saying spawn only. Well, I don't want to only randomize this value on the spawn. I want to randomize this value every frame. And if we do 0, 0, we're not adding anything to our frames. 0.1, we're going to get a very slow frame rate. But if we do something like 0.5, 1.5, every so often, it's going to skip a frame. I'm going to get like very, very small stutter. Now we're looking at a frame rate here of 64 frames in our flipbook. This is an 8x8. And also we're playing this kind of via the frame rate here. It's going to be really, really subtle, and we're not actually going to notice it. But when you've got 2 or 3 of them next to each other, occasionally, I'm sure you've all seen this, the two flipbooks will synchronize, and it'll be really obvious that they're doing the same thing. And fire never synchronizes. Obviously in real life you never have 2 flames that look exactly identical, and so by having a little extra randomness in your frame rate, you can get away with a kind of like occasional frame skip. It pops every now and again as the system resets, so if you're seeing that, that's what's happening. This is going to do it when it hits 10 seconds, the timeline preview here, but that won't happen in game. And again, these values are whatever we need them to be. So if we want it to be faster, now occasionally it's going to jump 2 frames. If we leave it at 0.5 to 1, now it's going to slow down. Occasionally we're going to get a double frame. And just that comparison, it's harder to see here. If we compare it in the world, let me just isolate them again so that we're not looking at the fixed frame rate versions. If I reset, to start with they're going to be completely synchronized, but over a few frames or a few seconds, now the timing has become completely independent, and that's not set on the play rate or the frame rate of the effect, but rather by jumping a frame and randomizing how much frame step we're doing. Cool, hopefully that makes sense. There's one more little thing we do want to do here. I mentioned the frame rate. Well, so the frame rate here in Niagara is frame locked. You can't go above 60, I believe it is, but it's a fixed frame rate. Possibly it's 240, but there's a fixed frame rate in here, and there's not a fixed frame rate in here. And so what you'll find is, because we're doing this as an add every frame, the number of frames affects how much we're adding, if that makes sense. So, so if our frame rate's running at 120, we're going to be adding and making a faster fire than if our frame rate's running at 160, at 60 or 30. So what we need to do is we need to make this frame rate independent. Now we could go in and set a fixed frame rate in here. It's in properties, fixed, that's fixed bounds, fixed delta time, but that's quite expensive. There are reasons to do this for physics simulations that require a fixed frame rate, but that's not something we need here. Instead, what we can do is take delta time and use that in our calculation here. So we're going to take our particle index, we're going to take our random value, and I'm going to multiply our random value. Let's do a random range here. Let's do 0.5, 1.5, and every frame. And it's going to be delta time, engine delta time, divided by our sort of target frame rate, which I'll put as 60 or 64. Now what this will do, if I've done this correct, I've done it wrong, no, it's multiplied, there we go. It should be a multiply float delta time, that makes sense, yep, by 64. So delta time, that's the time it has taken since the last frame. So how long did the last frame take? Well, we're assuming that the frame rate is about 64, and that's now going to give us a sort of speed based on a consistent speed when the frame rate is 64. But as delta time goes up, the values will get scaled, and as it goes down, it will get scaled as well. So the jumps that we're doing forwards in frames is right based on the number of frames that we're getting, if that makes sense. Cool. So as I say, as we reset this, it's going to be completely synchronized. Now by using a values 0.5, 1.5, they're going to be sort of equally spaced around 1, so our frame rate's going to be sort of consistent. We don't have to do that. There we go. After a few seconds here now, you can see that these two files, if I just zoom in on these two, oops. I mean, the shape is always going to be the same. We're talking about texture here. We can't really adjust that, at least not this way. But in terms of the synchronicity and timing of them, that's completely broken up now. Versus here at the start, the pulsing. And there's obviously more we can do. So if we wanted to do a random start frame, luckily the index here deals with the fact that this value is just going up and up and up. It's going to automatically kind of loop over our frame rate. So we can just add a value at the start. So in this case, if I just cut all of that and then add, and I'm going to do a random value. Now in this case, we do want it to be spawn only. We're just going to randomize a value from 0 to 64. That has not worked at all. Why not? So we're taking the index and we're doing, okay, let's not put it in here. Put that back. Let's put it in here. So index my parameter index, and now we'll do a random value from 0 to 64. There we go. So that's just doing a random start frame, and immediately that's going to help break up our repetition. That synchronized effect we were getting at the start before is now gone, and maybe that would be enough. But obviously with any randomness, there's a chance that you're going to get a bad result. And so if you randomize the two and they just happen to randomize the same start frame, they would be completely synchronized. And we can change the play rate as well. So in this case, our play rate's being controlled by this. So we could do a random range float every frame, but also multiplied by a random range float. And let's do 0.8, 1.2 at spawn time. And so this value will get randomized once and multiplied by this value. So now we're going to have slightly faster, slightly slower, but also with the frame skip occasionally as well. And hopefully you can see just how kind of varied these things can get. Just by randomizing things. Okay, I think that's probably enough for now. Quick summary: if we're dealing with something that has a physicality, which almost everything we do does, I guess pure magic stuff maybe doesn't, but anything like here, sparks, little glowing things in the sky, there is a physical element to what their properties are. The bigger it is, the brighter it is, the faster it moves, the longer it is, all these kinds of things, size, scale, lifetime, can be connected up purely by doing a random value first and then using that in our initialize to sort of lerp between min and max ranges. Really useful, I think adds a lot to sort of, say, the physicality, the sort of subtle realness of an effect. And then the second thing we're talking about, randomizing. Randomizing some things spawn, some things every frame. something you wouldn't necessarily think of as a thing that could be randomized as a sort of frame rate. We can actually do every frame a different random jump forwards, and that's really going to help with our sort of fires. Not every flipbook's going to work this way. Obviously, it depends. Fire's quite forgiving, and this is a 64 frame flipbook. If this was fewer frames, you'd struggle. You might see this sort of stutters a little bit more. But for something like this, I think it really can pay dividends, just because there's nothing that kills an effect worse than when you see two flipbooks exactly synchronized doing the same thing, and it looks so fake. Whereas here now, even though it's the same shapes, it feels much more forgiving. Cool. All right. Hopefully that helps. Something to think about with your own work, just how you're using randomness, where and when you're applying that randomization. As always, thank you to all my patrons and supporters for following this channel. If you do have any questions or comments, or you want to reach out, please let me know. And if you want to learn more about materials and particles, I've got some longer courses on Gumroad and Udemy. But with that, I will see you all next time.